It was June 14th, 1998, and everything that Michael Jordan had ever done in a basketball uniform was converging on a single possession in Salt Lake City. The Delta Center was loud in the way that only buildings carrying genuine consequence are loud, not the performed enthusiasm of a regular season crowd, but the dense, pressurized noise of 8,000 people who understood that the next 2 minutes would determine something permanent. The Chicago Bulls trailed the Utah Jazz by 1 point with 41 seconds remaining in Game 6 of the NBA Finals. One game, one possession, one moment that would either complete the greatest dynasty in the history of professional basketball or force a Game 7 that nobody could predict. The context of how the series had arrived at that moment required understanding the relationship between these two franchises across 2 consecutive finals appearances. Karl Malone and John Stockton had spent the better part of a decade building something in Utah that represented the best collective argument against the Bulls' model of excellence. Where Chicago was organized around a singular talent surrounded by complementary pieces, the Jazz were built on a partnership refined over thousands of repetitions until their pick-and-roll combination had become something close to a natural phenomenon, predictable in its form and somehow still unstoppable in its execution. They had lost to the Bulls in 1997 and had come back in 1998, more prepared, more determined, carrying the specific motivation that only a previous finals loss can generate. Jordan was 35 years old. The Bulls were in what everyone understood to be the final season of this particular configuration. Phil Jackson had signaled his departure. Scottie Pippen was heading toward free agency. The roster that had won 72 games and 3 consecutive championships was approaching its natural end. This gave the series an elegiac quality beneath the competitive intensity, the sense of watching something extraordinary arrive at its conclusion, and it gave every game a weight that extended beyond the outcome of the series into the larger question of how the dynasty would be remembered and how it would close. Bryon Russell had been assigned the primary defensive responsibility for Jordan throughout the series. This was not a punitive assignment. Russell was a legitimate NBA defender, 6'7", athletic, capable of using his length to make life difficult for elite offensive players in ways that smaller guards could not. He had competed against Jordan across multiple playoff series and had developed through that experience a specific understanding of Jordan's tendencies, his preferred spots, the slight tells in his footwork that preceded different offensive decisions. He operated without the illusion that he could stop Jordan, because nobody in the league operated under that illusion. The assignment was to make Jordan work, to take away the easiest versions of his actions, and to force him into the most difficult version of whatever he was going to do anyway. What Russell also carried into that final possession was the memory of something from the previous year. In the 1997 finals, Russell had been guarding Jordan in a critical late-game situation when Jordan made a crossover and drove for a significant basket. Afterward, Russell said in an interview that he believed Jordan had pushed off on the play, that a subtle extension of Jordan's left hand against Russell's hip had created the space Jordan needed and should have been called as an offensive foul. The comment was made without particular heat, as an honest assessment of what Russell believed he had experienced. But it had circulated through the basketball world and had become part of the background texture of their individual matchup. Jordan was aware of it. Russell was aware that Jordan was aware of it. These things accumulate in competitive relationships between elite players and become part of the psychological architecture of the games that follow. With the Bulls trailing by 1 and 41 seconds on the clock, Phil Jackson called timeout. The huddle was described by people close enough to observe it as remarkably calm given the circumstances, which was a reflection of Jordan's effect on the collective psychological state of his team. His demeanor in late-game situations had always operated as communication to his teammates, telling them through his own stillness and focus that the situation was manageable, that the outcome was something he had already processed and was waiting for the game to catch up to. Scottie Pippen said years later that the thing about playing alongside Jordan in critical moments was that his confidence was not performed. It was simply there, constant and structural, like a load-bearing element of the team's psychology that held everything else in place. The play Jackson drew up was a framework rather than a script, a set of options organized around Jordan's capacity to read the defense and make decisions in real time that no timeout diagram could fully anticipate. The core of it was space. Clear the side. Give Jordan the ball and the room to operate. Trust him to do what he had always done. Jordan brought the ball up the court with deliberateness, managing time as consciously as he was managing everything else. The Bulls needed a basket, but they also needed to control the clock so that Utah would have minimal time to respond. He advanced the ball slowly, reading the Jazz defense as it organized itself, watching Russell settle into his stance, noting the positioning of help defenders, assessing in the seconds available every variable that would inform the decision he was about to make. Russell was in a good defensive position. This was the honest assessment of people who watched the play analytically rather than through the lens of its outcome. He was not overplaying a direction. He was not reaching or gambling. He was in the stance and position that defensive coaching would prescribe for this situation. His weight balanced, his feet active, his length available without being committed in a direction Jordan could exploit. He had done his preparation. He was executing it correctly. The problem was not his preparation or his execution. The problem was who he was executing it against. Jordan made his move with approximately 28 seconds remaining. He came off a screen from Tony Kukoc on the left side and caught the ball at the top of the key with Russell recovering to get in front of him. For a half second, they faced each other in the way that offensive and defensive players face each other in isolation situations. The entire game reduced to the space between two people and the question of what happens next. Russell was close enough to contest a jump shot. He was back far enough to prevent an easy drive. He was, in the language of defensive basketball, in the right place. Jordan put the ball on the floor to his right, a hard dribble designed to test Russell's lateral commitment. Russell moved with it correctly. Jordan came back left with a crossover, and here the sequence entered territory that has been examined and debated for more than 2 decades. The crossover was accompanied by a movement of Jordan's left hand that made contact with Russell's right hip. Whether this contact was incidental to the crossover motion or a deliberate extension designed to create space depends on who you ask and what framework they bring to the question. What is not in dispute is what happened as a result. Russell's momentum carried him a step in the direction Jordan had come from, creating a gap that was small in absolute terms, but enormous in basketball terms, the difference between a contested shot and a relatively open one. Jordan stopped. Russell was a step behind him and recovering. Jordan elevated from approximately 15 feet, his body gathering itself with the efficiency of a movement performed so many thousands of times that it required no conscious direction, just the activation of something encoded deeply enough to operate without interference from the pressure surrounding it. His release was at the apex of his jump, his right hand finishing through the ball with the follow-through that every coach who watched him shoot described as the most consistently reproduced in the sport. Russell's hand was in his face, not decorative defense, actually contesting the shot with his length and his recovery in the time available. The ball went in. The Bulls led by 1. The Delta Center went quiet in a way it had not been quiet at any point in the game. The silence of a crowd that has been expecting one thing and has experienced another, that needs a moment to process the gap between anticipation and reality before the noise returns, carrying the desperate frequency of a building that understands it needs something extraordinary in the seconds remaining. Utah got the ball and ran their offense with controlled urgency. Stockton advanced it. The Jazz ran their actions, and with 6 seconds left, Stockton found a look at a three-pointer from the right wing. The shot went up and missed. Jordan secured the rebound, and the game was over. The Bulls won by 1, 6 championships. The dynasty was complete. What happened on the floor immediately after the buzzer became among the most reproduced images in the history of American sport. Jordan, with his fist raised and his eyes closed, releasing everything the season and the series and the years had required of him. Pippen embracing him with the force of someone who understood what they had shared and what it had cost. Jackson finding his players one by one with the quiet acknowledgement of a man who knew that what had been built would not be rebuilt, that the ending he was witnessing was final in a way that required recognition rather than celebration. Bryon Russell sat on the floor for a moment after the final buzzer with the posture of a man who had competed completely and arrived at an outcome his competition did not deserve to produce but had produced anyway. He had been in the right position. He had made the right reads. He had contested the shot with his body and his preparation and everything available to him. None of it had been enough, which was not a reflection of his inadequacy, but of Jordan's completeness. The crossover and the shot were analyzed immediately and continuously in the days and weeks that followed. The push-off question was examined from every available camera angle and debated by everyone from former players to officiating experts. The consensus among people who watched most carefully was that the contact was real rather than imagined, and that whether it constituted a violation was a question reasonable people could answer differently. What was not debatable was the outcome. The ball went through the net. The championship was decided. Jordan said in the press conference that the last shot was a play he had made before, and that when the situation presented itself, he trusted his preparation and his instinct and did not think about anything except the execution. He was characteristically economical with the words, not because the moment was insufficient to warrant more, but because language had never been the medium in which he expressed himself most honestly. The court was his medium. The ball was his language. 41 seconds in Salt Lake City was his final statement in a career built entirely on delivering statements that no one could answer. Phil Jackson said something in his post-game comments that went slightly deeper than the play itself. He said that what made Jordan's late-game performances so consistent across so many years was not simply the technical quality of his shooting or his ability to create space. It was the relationship he had developed with high-stakes moments, not a tolerance for them, which is what most athletes at best achieve, but something closer to a preference, that the conditions which diminished other players made Jordan more completely himself. That pressure did not compress him. It clarified him. Bryon Russell, in interviews conducted years later, answered the questions about the final possession with honesty and without self-pity. He said he had competed to the absolute limit of what he could bring to the situation. He said Jordan had made a great play, and that great plays sometimes involve contact that officials miss, and that was part of the game. He said he had no regrets about how he competed in that series or on that possession. And then he said something that reframed the entire experience in a way that only time and perspective make possible. He said that being part of that moment, even as the person on the wrong end of it, was its own form of significance. That history needs witnesses as well as makers. That he had been close enough to touch what was happening, close enough to contest it, close enough to feel the full force of what Jordan was in the moments that defined his career. And that standing that close to something that extraordinary, even when it went against you, was something most people never got to experience at all. The 1998 championship was the last thing the dynasty produced. Jordan retired that summer. The Bulls were dismantled in the way championship teams are dismantled when the people who built them decide the building is finished. Jackson left. Pippen left. The roster dispersed into the ordinary movement of professional sports, the particular configuration that had produced something extraordinary dissolving into its components and moving on. What remained was the image. Jordan at 15 feet, Russell a half step behind him. The ball leaving his hand at the apex of his jump. The follow-through completing itself against a crowd that had spent 6 games trying to prevent exactly this. The net moving, the fist, the closed eyes, the dynasty complete. The last sentence of the greatest story professional basketball had ever told, written in the only language that had ever mattered, not with words or arguments or predictions, but with the ball going through the net at the moment when everything depended on it, the way it had always gone in, complete, final, beyond dispute.